last time we were looking at Mishnah Tamid. I read into the beginning of Mishnah Gimel, but before I do that, before we continue in Mishnah Gimel, Shira, you had a question that you wrote me, which I want to address. Hang on one second. So Shira, can you repeat your question? Can you tell us what your question was from last time?
Yeah, my question belongs to the immersion after the emission as an emission. So the Baal Keri, we know it happened at night or in early morning, and so the priest is obligated to go not under the temple and the Mesibah, using the Mesibah to surround this holy area, but then to enter in the mikveh, and then waiting until the doors of the temple would be open early in the morning. And then he must leave and wait until sunset, we know, because the impurity remains until sunset. So my question is, normally we know about the both you have Tevilah in the evening and waiting until sunset, and then you become again pure and able to participate in the service and whatever. But my question is, what is the meaning and of this very early immersion? Because it's not fitting, it does not bring up the purity for the Kohanim. So what is the meaning and the purpose of this very early first immersion? Because if the priest returns to the temple, he must, before every Avodah, he is obligated to immerse. So my question is, what is the meaning of this first immersion? That's in a short speaking. Okay.
So
yeah.
The meaning of the immersion, well, I think to take it simply, he became Tameh, and so the first thing he should do is to try to make himself tahor. So that's what he does. So he goes and he makes himself tahor. We learned in a previous shiur that no one actually is allowed to come into the Beit HaMikdash who's tameh. And here he is tameh. So he needs to. There's two things to take into consideration. One is that he's actually tameh because he had an emission. He was a Baal Keri. So and he's also technically in the Beit HaMikdash. The other thing is to remember, which we're just learning now, he's locked in. He's not going to, right? The doors are locked to leave. He can't leave until Ad Shesharim Niftachim. So he's going to do whatever he can to make himself tahor while he's in the Beit HaMikdash. But then the moment the doors open, he's going to leave. So the other thing that we need to explain here, which in your email, you address this, and those, at least Michael Schwartz and maybe Michael Warner, I don't remember. We learned in the very beginning of Masechet Brachot, this idea of the Tavul Yom.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah. You remember that. So
I remember, yes.
So what's a Tavul Yom? Can you?
A Tavul Yom is somebody who is dunked, but he's not formally tahor until sundown. So he's basically somebody who's in that in-between state. So dunked, but not yet tahor.
Right, broadly speaking, that's correct. So somebody became tameh. In any number of different ways he could become tameh. And when he doubles, he enters into a stage of tahara, even though the day has not yet ended. So technically he becomes a sheni l'tumah. So just to remind us, or to explain for people who don't know, right? So tumot go in there are levels of tumah. At the top, you have, let's say, a dead body is avi avota tumah. What that means is a person who comes in contact with it, or a kli that comes in contact with it, or in that case is under an oath with it, even if they don't touch it, that person or kli will become an av tumah, right? So it goes down a level. The mate is avi avota tumah, and then the person is now, we'll just talk about the person for the purpose of this discussion. He's now an av hatumah, and he in turn can be mitameh kelim, right? He can be mitameh other kelim. So let's say the clothes that he's wearing, they become tameh. They're a sheni l'tumah, right? So it went avi avot and av hatumah, and then rishon l'tumah. I'm sorry, the rishon l'tumah, and they can be mitameh truma. If they touch truma, the truma becomes tameh, and so on. Not every, the lowest level you can get is a revi'i, but that only happens with kodesh. It only happens with korbanot and things of that nature. The tvul yom, for this purpose, is a sheni l'tumah, and so he is not allowed to come into contact with truma. However, he is allowed to come in contact and eat maaser sheni. This gets into a very detailed discussion about the different levels of tumah. It doesn't matter so much for what we're talking about now, but I did want to say that the way Michael put it, broadly speaking, is correct. The Tful Yom has a kind of intermediary status that for certain he is tahor, and for certain purposes he is tameh. So the Baal Keri, who we were, who's mentioned in the first Mishnah, so at that moment he is tameh. When he goes to the mikvah, now he becomes sheni l'tumah, and at that point he will not be able to do any avodah in the Beit Mikdash, but he has to wait to leave because he was locked in, so he'll leave as soon as possible. And then at night, he could, once nightfall comes, he would be able to eat truma, and depending on the kind of truma, let's say, well, here in the case of Baal Keri, not so much, but we talked about, let's say, a mitzorah, who also has to bring korbanot in order to finish his tahara. So until he brings his korbanot the next morning, he would not be allowed to eat kodesh, right? He would not be allowed to eat korbanot. So does that more or less answer your question? Does that help?
Yeah,
Shira?
yeah.
Yeah.
But the problem is you must leave, and okay, we have the time between getting the emission and waiting until the doors will be open. So it's a dangerous time. So you must,
as it were, yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Shale?
So here, and I'll show. Yes.
What is the origin of all this tum'ot? This already in the Torah, or does it come from the Mishnah or from the Chachamim?
All of the tumot that I'm talking about are all midioraita. They're all mentioned explicitly in the Torah.
Okay.
But not everything that we talk about in Tumah is in the Torah. Some of it is Gzerot Rabbanan. But all of these things that I've mentioned, yes, they're in the Torah. We learn them out in the Torah. And one of the sugyot actually is in the very beginning of Masechet Brachot, where the Mishnah says, right, that Ne'ematai Korin et Shah Ba'arvi, Bishah shekohanim nichnasim lechol bitrumatan. So so when do Kohanim go in to eat their truma? It's referring to Kohanim who became tamei during the day, who went to the mikvah during the day, and then at Seita Kochavim, they are now tahor maspik, right? They're sufficiently tahor that now they are allowed to eat their truma. And the sugya there at the bottom of Daf Bet Amud Aleph, in the beginning of Daf Bet Amud Bet, that's one of the important sources for this discussion. I'll just also point out, just a second. In the Mishnah Middot, right? So I know that Shira has been doing this, and of course, you're all invited to this yourself. There are a number of parallels between there are a number of parallels between Mishnayot that we find in Tamid and Mishnayot we find in Middot, and sometimes, in fact, they're repeated. I'll talk about that more as time goes on. By the way, Shira, I don't know if you saw in chat, but Tommy asks you to move your mic closer or be closer to your mic when you speak. So this Mishnah that we're talking about is actually that's in the beginning of Tamid. We find it also here at the end of the first chapter of Midot. It says, Eira kere be'achad mehem. Right, so one of the Kohanim who is inside, and he's Balkari, he has an emission, right? He sees semen. So he goes into this misibah, this sort of underground cavern that's underneath the Beit HaMikdash, and there's lights on either side until he gets to where he has to tavel. In here it says, right, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov b'misibah ha'olechet tachat ha'chel yotzei v'holech lo betadi. In the cavern that he goes underneath the chel. The chel is the area that's immediately outside of the Beit HaMikdash. Basically, the chel is the rest of Har HaBayit, outside of the walls of the Beit HaMikdash. And Tadi is one of the sha'arim, it's one of the gates that leads into the chel. So he, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, he actually had a direct way out. He didn't have to wait until the doors were unlocked in the morning. The other thing I'll just point out here is that the Bar Tanura elaborates here a little bit. He doesn't go back, right? Because we were talking about the Kohanim who were in the Beit HaMoked, and one of them got carry, and then he goes down to Tavel. And according to the Tanakama, so go back up to the Beit HaMoked and then wait until the doors open. And according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, he doesn't have to go back to the Beit HaMoked. Rather, right, because there's a way out for him. There's a way to leave. And we mentioned last time that this whole area that's underneath the Beit HaMikdash itself is not kadosh, even though it's right under the Beit HaMikdash in the area of the Beit HaMikdash. So, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, the moment he becomes tamei, he actually leaves the Kodesh area by going underground, going to the mikvah. There was a route out that would lead him out without having him to go back through any part of the Beit HaMikdash. And ve'eno chozer leBeit HaMoked, lefi shu tvul yom, right? In other words, he shouldn't go back. In fact, because he is a tvul yom. And yom should not be in the Beit HaMikdash. Bein halacha k'Rabbi Yozer ben Yaakov. Actually, halacha is not like that. Ela k'ditnan bereish Tamid. The halacha is as we learn in the beginning of Tamid, the Mishnah that we did last week. Ba v'yashav lo eitz halacha v'kohanim bebeit hamoked ad she'arim niftachim. He goes back and sits amongst his priestly brethren in the Beit HaMoked until the gates open. Yotzei v'holech lo, and then he leaves and goes. Sha'af al gav shetvul yom asur lihikanes le'ezrat nashim dainu mnei leviyah lezeh hekelu lefi shenitma bifnim. Right? So even though a tvul yom is not even allowed to come into the ezrat nashim, is effectively the Machaneh Leviyah. In other words, it's parallel to the Machaneh Leviyah that was in the Midbar. I'll explain a little bit more in a second. But for this one, they were mekel, the Chachamim were mekel to let him stay inside the boundaries of the Beit HaMikdash. Since he became Tameh inside, they didn't make him leave right away. That was the machlok. This is the machloka between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yozer ben Yaakov. And just a second. I think you saw I sent out among other things, I sent you the drawing of the Beit HaMikdash that's from the Ktav Yad of the Rambam himself. This was his drawing, which is found in the Perusha Mishnayot of the Rambam in Ma'adurat Rav Kafir. That's published by Musar Rav Kook. And so it's a bit crude, but we'll look at it just to put some things into perspective here. And I think I set this up.
So are we saying
Yes,
that,
you did.
this was his handwriting?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes. It's very cool. He drew a number of illustrations for the Peru. And Mishnah Middot, in fact, there are a number of them. I sent you two of them. Rav Kappa explains it, by the way, just as a side note, in his edition of the Perusha Mishnayot of the Rambam, that he was beginning with his grandfather. Rav Kappa came from of Rabbanim, right, of outstanding Rabbanim, and beginning, I believe, with his grandfather, who were in Teiman, right? They were in Teiman. They started to gather up the autographed manuscripts of the Rambam himself, of the Perusha Mishnayot, and other texts as well. And he managed to gather the Rambam's actual handwritten manuscripts. I guess that's a little bit repetitive, but he found the autographed manuscripts of the Rambam on nearly all of the Masechtot of the Mishnah, nearly everything. And the ones that he couldn't find, he found near contemporaneous copies that were made in Teiman. So these are probably the most accurate, it's probably the most accurate edition of the Rambam's Perush. And I will point out, because it came up actually in something a little bit later in the Shia, it's important to look at Rav Kafich's translation, because the earlier translations, the translations that were printed in the standard editions that we still have today, are not always correct. They were not always translated by people who knew Arabic that well, right? It was the original Perush was written in Judeo-Arabic. All of it was written in Judeo-Arabic. And there were different people who had been asked along the way or decided to try to translate the manuscripts or translate the Perush, some of whom were more learned than others. So if you ever use this edition, there are copious notes, and many times Rav Kafich will point out mistakes that were made in the original, in the earlier translations. I'll get into that later because it becomes relevant for something later in the Mishnah. But in terms we're talking about now, so here in the picture, but you can see over here, this is this area here. This is the Beit HaMoked, which leads. Hold on, I'm gonna try to get a little bit bigger. This is Sha'ar Beit HaMoked, right? So these were the northern Sha'arim. This area, this broad area here, oh, that's not the right tool, just a second. This whole area here and around it, this is the Chel that I was mentioning before, right? So this area, but the exact placement of Beit HaMoked is not necessarily exactly the way you see it here, but these two lishkot, which are in the Beit HaMoked, they were in an area that was considered to be Kodesh, and these two parts here were not Kodesh. This one here, it's hard to read, but it says this one here, this where if you became Tameh, well, if you were one of these Kohanim who became Tameh, this was the place that you would walk down into to go underneath the Bira, underneath the Mikdash, to go Tavel. That's this part here. So this whole building here is the Beit HaMoked, and it had 4 leaves. There was something. Okay, we'll come back to this. We'll come back to this. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, yeah, good question. Look, there are a lot. You should always ask these questions. There's stuff that's going on here, and try not to get too bogged down. But it's important that things are as clear as possible. So I think now we'll go back to the Mishnah. Right, so this is what we did last week from the beginning, right? We talked about where the Kohanim are Shomrim B'Beit HaMikdash, and then we talked a little bit about Zignei Beit Av Yishenim Sham. This was in the Beit HaMoked. Beit HaMoked Kippah. The Beit HaMoked was a dome, or it had a dome on. Uvayit Gadol Haya was a large building. Mukaf Rovadim Shel Even. Inside, we said it had these sort of layered kinds of broad stairs. And the elders of the Beit Av, Yishenim Sham, they would sleep there at night. Umaftechot Azara biyadam. They held the keys to the Azara. Kisto ba'are. By the way, one of the things that came up last week, we were talking about one of the Perushim of Rovim was young Kohanim, and Pirchei Kuna were also young Kohanim. The Tosfot Yontam says the Rovim would have been underage Kohanim. They wouldn't be old enough to do any avodah, and so they would let them do the shmirah, because that's not technically avodah. There's a mitzvah of doing it considered to be technically avodah. Avodah are the pubescent Kohanim. They're older. There's the pricha. It refers to them starting to get facial hair, right? It's starting to blossom, right? Their facial hair. And Ishkisto Ba'aretz, right? So that they were sleeping on the ground. The Barton would explain that they would take their clothing and fold it up, put it next to their head. I'm going to skip this a little bit because that's what we were talking about. Okay. Then we said, Mishu Rotzeli Troma to Mizbeach Mashkim Betovel actually Avoha Mimune. Whoever wanted to do Trumata Deshen, he would get up early to Tavel before the Mimune would come. And the Mimune would come sometimes Ifnei Kriyat HaGever, sometimes after Kriyat HaGever. HaMimune Ba V'dofek Alehem. The Mimune would come presumably on the outside of the Beit HaMoked, the Dofek Alehem, and he would knock on them, or in other words, knock on the door, Vehem Patchulo, and then they would open the door for him. Amar Lehen Misha Taval Yavoi Yafis. He said, whoever tavels will come and do the pais, right? They'll do the lottery. Hefisu Zacha Misha Zacha. They do the pais, and whoever won the pais, they won, right? So then they would do it. Hang on a second. I didn't give myself the right document, so I'm going to open it from a different place. Just a second. Okay, now we're up to Mishnah Gimel. Natalat Mafteach Ufatachet Pishpash. So he took the key. In Masechet Middot, it describes where there was a key kept, actually, but I'm going to leave that for now. But in any event, then the Mimuneh, he came in, he would take the key of Ufatachet Pishpash. He would open the Pishpash, which is, as I mentioned, it's a door that's inside a larger door. He would go in from the Beit HaMoked into the Azara. And then they, in other words, the Kohanim who were there, like the Ziknei Beit Av and the Pirchei Kuna, presumably, and they had two torches of fire in their, because now, right, it's either a little before, or the first light, or a little bit after the first light. It's not really yet light, so they still need some extra light. They would divide into two groups. Elu hochim b'achsadra derech hamizrach, ve'elu hochim b'achsadra derech hama'arav. Right, so the two groups would split up. One would go in the achsadra, in the portico, in an easterly direction, and the other would go in the portico in a westerly direction. And I'll show you that on the map in a second. Hayu bodkin v'holchin, and they would check and go. Ad shemagim l'makom beit osei chavitim, until they came to the house of the people who made the chavitim. And we'll talk a little bit more about that also. Higiu elu ve'elu, these would arrive. Amru shalom, hakol shalom. Right? So they would greet each other. These would say hello, and they would say everything is fine. They would probably exchange it back and forth. Right? Shalom, hakol shalom, shalom, hakol shalom. Midos chavitim lasot chavitim, and then they would put the people who make the chavitim to start making the chavitim. So let's look back for a second at the map. And by the way, I started teaching myself a little bit more about how to make a nice sort of architectural drawing using the computer, but I think it's going to take me a while. Okay, but this is what I'm talking about. The Mimuneh, he came in through the door here, and then he's going to go through the Shar Beit HaMoked here, and he's going to go with these other Kohanim, and they split into groups, right? So one of the groups is going to go east. So this is east. And one group is going to go west, right? So that direction. And basically what each of them is doing, they're going to go all the way around. Just a second. I'm going to cut through what are probably walls here so it's not the exact that they took, but roughly the route they took. So that was the route. So one group goes here and all the way around, and it ends up here, and the other group goes here, and in this direction, they all end up here. This is Lishkat Beito Se Chavitin. This is where they would bake the chavitin for the Kohen Gadol. So I think it's interesting to see. So what this is, so the Achsadra, so the Rambam doesn't draw the Achsadra. If you can imagine, basically these places where I made the red lines, if you can imagine that they'd be more like this. משהו כזה. Actually, it would be closer to the wall the way I did here. They would be stuck against the wall. So the Achsadra, as I think I mentioned last time, it's a covered walk, right? So in other words, there would be in these areas now that I've done in red, that there would be columns on the ground that would reach up to about halfway up the height of this area, and then there would be a schacha, there would be like a kind of a roof on top of that, and that
portico.
roofing, yes, as I mentioned earlier, it's a portico. Right? There would be roofing that would go all the way around. Right? So the Achsadra is a portico that was in the confines of the Beit HaMikdash itself. And they would go around, and essentially this was part of the morning duty, to go around and check up, do this kind of morning checkup on everything, which we'll describe in a little bit more detail. Moment. Hold on.
What are they checking for?
So that's what we'll describe in a moment. Let's see. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. What did you?
So I guess that assume that the vessel, the kelim, you need for baking, for preparing whatever the procedure of baking this mincha. checked it. Bukerim.
Right. So they're going to be checked for various kelim actually. So let's look at the Bar Tanura. Right, נטלת את המפתח ופתח את הפשפש. פשפש פתח קטן שבתוך גופו של פתח גדול. Right, a pishpash is a wicket. It's a little opening that's inside of the body of a bigger opening. Ubo hayu nichmi bet hamoked azara, and they would enter in the wicket in order to get into the azara. And so the azara that we're talking about is the area that they go into, and that is Azarat Kohanim. We mentioned earlier, hold on, I'll switch back quickly. This whole area here, right? So this whole area here is the Ezrat Nashim. And depending on your status of Tuma, right? So you have to be Tahor to get in here. There are different levels of Tahara that you have to get to in order to get in to this Azara, the Ezrat Kohanim. The Ezrat Nashim, what the Bar Tanur alluded to earlier, is that it's like the Machaneh Leviyah, that in the Midbar, right? So in the Midbar, in the middle of the encampment, you had the Mishkan that was surrounded by the Klaim. So, and that's that area of the Klaim, and where the Mishkan was is more or less parallel to what we see here in the main part. And then on all four sides, for 2,000 amot, you had the Machaneh Leviyah, and then beyond that, you had Machaneh Yisrael. Right? You had all the 12 tribes in, 3 tribes in each direction. And so you had 3 machanot that we would talk about for halachic purposes, we talk about machanot, and the Torah also talks about in the beginning of Bamidbar. But you had Machaneh Leviyah, which would include the center of which would be the Mishkan. But when the Bar Tanur talks about Machaneh Leviyah, that Ezrat Nashim is Machaneh Leviyah, means for halachic purposes it had a similar din to the Machaneh Leviyah in the Midbar. Right, and then you had, like I say, you had Machaneh Yisrael, and then after that was Michutz Machaneh. And as you know, depending on your Tumah, like a Mitzorah, actually, when a Mitzorah became Tameh, he had to leave all of the Machanot. He had to go completely out of all Machanot until such time that he become Tahor. Tamei Meit could be in Machaneh Yisrael, right? Depending on your level of Tumah would determine where up to how close to the Mishkan or how close to the Beit HaMikdash, as it were, that you could get to, and there was this parallel, a geographic parallel in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. Bachsadra Shebazara. So they would go, so the Mimuneh would go through the Beit HaMoked into the Azara, and then he would be accompanied by these people. They would split into 2 groups, and they would go into the Achsadra. The Bar Tanur says Sheba Azara, this Achsadra that was in the Azara, would go Derech HaMizrach, Shayu Achsadraot Saviv LaAzara Mibifnim. So this is what we just saw on the map. Right, that there were porticos around the Azara from inside. Amudim yotzim chutz kotlei ha'azara. There were columns that would go outside of the walls of the Azara. When he means outside, he doesn't mean into the chel. He means that they went from where you would be standing inside next to the wall. Then beyond that, inside, there would be columns. Umin ha'amudim va'ad kotlei ha'azara hayaschach agabehen vehen kruyin portikan belaz. Right? So right between these amudim and the walls of the Azara, there would be a schach on top of them, porticos. Umina amudim v'lachutz haya below schach. Beyond, in other words, the schach only went out a certain amount, and then beyond that there would be no schach. The Mizbeach was in a place where there was no schach. They would divide into two groups. All of the kelim that they would use for the avodah, the Beit HaMikdash, the klei sharet, they would see them. Shiyu kulan bin koman bishalom. They wanted to make sure that all of the kelim were in their proper place. Vayu holchim b'chsadraot hasuyot l'tzad ruach tzfonit. They would go in these porticos that were in the northern side. Elu malchim ba b'chetzia shel tzad. So one group would go in the half that was toward the east, right, the eastern side. The others would walk in the half that goes toward the western side. They would go until they met up with each other at the place where they would do the chavitin for the Kohen Gadol. That he would bring every day half of it in the morning and half of it in the evening. It was close, this Beit Chavitin was near Shar Nikanor. We'll look at it again in a second. That's where they would greet each other. Klomar, what were they saying? Klomar, matzanu chol hakelim b'shalom v'lo nifkad mehem kli. Right? When they were shalom hakol shalom, what they were saying is that we found all of our kelim and nothing was missing. They're all in their proper place. Everything is there. So we'll take another quick look here. Right, so this area here, this is the Beit Osei Chavitin, and this here is Shar Nikanor. And we mentioned, what do we know about Shar Nikanor from earlier in the Mishnah?
One of the more miracles.
Yeah, what was the miracle?
A long story. About
You sound like you were there.
Nicanor went down to Egypt to bring the doors for the temple, and so a stormy weather came up, and so the seamen threw one of the door in the sea, but nothing changed. And so Nicanor, like, it's the opposite to Yona. He offered himself, so the second door, one door is kept under the sheep, and it will be sure brought home to Jerusalem, and the reward all. Again, the second door. So sorry, I forgot the details, but
No, you're doing very well, right? So one of the it turned right. So he offered himself, and so as soon as he offered himself, then what happened? The storm subsided.
Yeah. Okay, that's it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
so they didn't have to second door, and then when they arrived in Akko, what did they see? That the first door came up from under the ship, so it accompanied the whole way. So right, those are the miracles. And so this part here, that is this area here. This is Shar Nikanor, right? This is actually where the doors for that Shar were put up next to Beit Osei Chavitin. The other thing I want to show you, I think I prepared it. I wanted to explain a little bit more about the chavitim themselves, even though it's not our immediate concern, but it is relevant because we'll have more when we get to Yoma. I think I may have explained it wrong in a previous year, so I'll just get it in simply straight from the Rambam. The Rambam says here in Hilchot Maaseh HaKorbanot, Perek Halacha Bet, Ketzad Asiyat Chavit Kohen Gadol. How were the chavitim of the Kohen Gadol made? Mevi isaron shalem. They bring an entire isaron. An isaron is a volumetric measure. It's 1/10 of an ephah, which, depending on which shita you hold by, is maybe about, in volume about 3, let's say minus 3.5 liters, or which would be about 3 or 3.5 kilo. So it's a lot of flour, right? They bring this an isaron of flour, umaktisho. They would dedicate it. They would dedicate it to be brought for the chavitim. Then v'chotzehu b'chatzi isaron shebemikdash. They would divide it into a half isaron according to the measurement that they used in the mikdash. Shafal pishi kreva chatzin ena mitkadeshet l'chatzin. Even though it's brought in 2 parts, it's not dedicated in 2 parts. In other words, first you bring in the whole isaron and dedicate that, you're makdish that, and then you divide it. Umevi ma shoshet lugin shemen. They would bring 3 lug of shemen. Shenamar b'shemen teaseh. Losif la shemen k'nischei hakeves. Right? They would add on it was a son of shemen that was used for the mesachim for a keves. Ubolel hasolet shemen. They would mix, right? So the isaron that we're talking about is an isaron of solet. It's an isaron of fine flour. They would mix the fine flour with the oil. The cholta berotchin, right? So they would make this kind of dough with just the flour and the oil, and then they would, the way it was cooked, it would be thrown into boiling water. That's the chalita that was thrown into like boiling water. V'lash mikol chatzi yisaron shesh chalot, and then they would take it out. That, in other words, the havdil, it's a little bit like the way you make bagels, right? In other words, you make a dough and you boil the dough, and then you take the dough and then you bake it. And that's how they made these chavitim. They would make a dough made out of fine flour with oil. They would do chalita. They would boil dough. Then they would take it out, and right, they've already divided it into two parts. And from each half isaron, they would make 6 chalot. Nimtzu'u shtei mesrei chalot. And so you come out with 12 chalot. So 6 chalot then would be brought in the morning, and 6 chalot would be brought in the evening. That's b'kitzur, that's the Chavitei Kohen Gadol. And again, we will talk about a little bit more, maybe a little bit here and a little bit when we get back into Yoma. So let's see. Okay, so that's
Shel, what is lechem hapanim?
So that's something else. That's something else. So lechem hapanim. We will talk a little bit about that also. Like I'll bring a little bit more information of it. But yes, it is it's clear, right, that there seems to be there's at least something in common, right? What do the Chavi have in common with the lechem hapanim? I mean, aside from the fact that they're both baked things that they made in the Beit HaMikdash.
What did they put in the ma'arechet? What did they put in the ma'arechet? There was
into the shulchan.
Yes.
In the shulchan that was the lechem hapanim. The team would be, we'll see. They were offered. So what they had in common is that there were 12 lechem apanim, and there's also 12 chavit of the Kohen Gadol. But the 12 chavitim of the Kohen, they're brought every day. The lechem apanim is brought only once a week, and it gets spit out every Shabbat. And what gets switched out, in other words, whatever sat there for the week, then that would be eaten by Kohanim of that mishmar and that Beit Av. That's what they would eat. We'll talk a little bit more about it as we get to it in the Mishnah. I digressed a little bit on the Chavitim because we mentioned them before and they're mentioned here. And here's, so there was a special place in the Beit Dash to make the Chavitim. Right, so now we're in Mishnah Daled. Misha Zachali Yitromat HaMizbeach, Hu Yitromat HaMizbeach. Right, so this is pretty straightforward. Who is Zocheh to Toremet HaMizbeach, so he would do the Truma. So who would be Zocheh? How are they chosen? Just to bear in mind. How did they get picked? By the pais, right? So that was the first pais that we saw that is mentioned in the second chapter in Yoma. And so now they're pais, right? This is just following up from Mishnah Bet, right? That the Mimunah said, right, the people who wanted to do it had gotten up early and they tavled already. And then the Mimunah said to the Misha Tavavo v'Yafis, whoever had tavled, he can come and participate in the pais. Efisu zacha misha zacha. So they would do the pais. Whoever won. And so he was chosen. Then they would do this like dika around the inside of the walls of the Azara. And then Misha Zachali Trumat Mizbeach, whoever won the pais to do Trumat Hadeshen, who Yitramat Mizbeach, that this would be the time he would do it. Momrimlo, they would say to him, Hizaher Shemet Tiga Bekli. Be careful lest you touch a vessel. Ad Tikadesh Yadecha V'Raglecha Min HaKiyor. Until right before you would wash your hands and legs from the kiyor. V'harei hamachta netuna b'miktsoa bein hakevesh lamizbeach. Behold, the machter, like the coal shovel, was placed in the corner between the ramp, bein hakevesh lamizbeach, between the ramp and the mizbeach, b'ma'aravo shel kevesh, on the western side of the kevesh. We'll look at that a little bit in a moment. Ein adam nichnas imo, nobody goes in with him. V'lo ner biyado, and there's no candle in his hand. Ele mahalech leor hama'aracha. Rather, he would go and walk in by the light of the fire that was on top of the mizbeach. Right. So who are we talking about? Nobody goes in with him, and
Kohen Gadol.
he doesn't have a. Why would you say the
other Kohanim?
Who are we talking about at the beginning of the Mishnah?
Okay, never mind. So it's the person who was zocheh to litrom et hamiz.
Right. In other words, so that this is
chosen by
right. So whoever won the lottery to do Trumat Hadeshen, they would tell him, other Kohanim would tell him to be careful not to touch a kli until he would wash his hands and legs for. And it mentions the machta. So why does it mention the machta? The machta is like a
for cleaning the ashes from the altar to perform the Trumat Hadeshen.
Right, presumably he needs that to do Trumat Hadeshen. So it was near by, right? It was next to the Mizbeach. And Ein Adam Nichnasimo, nobody would go in with him. And there's, because remember, again, we're at a time when there's not really, there's all we see in terms of natural light is it's the earliest light of the morning. So there's like, you can see light off in the horizon, but it's not light outside, right? As we saw, the people, when they're doing the bedikah, they go with torch to the bedikah. And now he has to go outside of wherever, in other words, he's going to leave his friends who have the torch, and there isn't a lot of natural light. But how will he be guided? He'll be guided by the light that's burning on the Mizbeach itself. And nobody goes with him, right? When that's Trumat Hadesh, he's going to go by himself. He's going to go and be guided by the light that's burning on the top of the Mizbeach. So why were they warning him? Shemet Yiga Bekli. The part 2 expands a little bit. He's ahead. Yiga Bekli b'machta shehi kli sharet. Be careful not to touch the machta, which you're going to need for the Trumat Hadeshen before you washed, right? So he would have to wash his hands and legs. She'en adam rashai likrav el mizbeach v'lo l'shum avodah ad kadesh yadav v'raglav. Right? No one is allowed to come up to the mizbeach or to do any kind of formal avodah in the Beit HaMikdash until he has washed his hands and his legs from the kior. And we saw that in Yoma, right? That the Gadol is going to have to, on Yom Kippur, he's going to do 5 tevilot, and 10 times he's going to wash his hands. And so, but we see that that was a normal thing, that if you were going to do avodah, you also had to wash your hands and legs. B'miktzah b'keren zavit, right? Miktzah is the
This is not the same machta you use for the l'encens, for the
for the Ktoret.
For Ktoret.
They had a number of them, and they actually we'll see on Yom Kippur there were special ones that they used. This one I think is not the same as the one that would be used for the Ktoret, but this is one that was used specifically for Trumat Hadeshen, I believe. I'm pretty sure that's correct. Let's take another quick look at our marked up map.
Was the fire burning all the time?
Yes. Yes.
It shouldn't go. It shouldn't stop. It shouldn't go out. The fire.
Right. How do we know that? How do we know that it didn't? How do we where do we know that it was at least supposed to be burning all the time? Where do we?
I know from the beginning. Yeah, from Parashat Tzav, from the chapter.
Parashat Tzav. Eish tamid tukara mizbeach lo tichbe. Right, there is I'm jumping the gun, but that, yes, exactly what you said. It's
I thought Eish Tamid is the menorah. No, it's not the same.
No, it's not the same. It's not the same. That's a different thing. We taught, and we will come back also to the lighting of the menorah. I started to get into it in his shiur, and we'll go back into it in greater detail. But no, the Eish Tamid tukara mizbeach lo tichbe. Just a second. It's right here. I have it here. Just to remind us, right? So this is the parsha of Trumat Hadeshen, beginning of Parshat Tzav. Tzav et Aaron ve'al panav lemor zot Torat ha'olah hi ha'olah al mokda al mizbeach kol halayla ad haboker ve'esh ha'mizbeach tukad bo. Right. So it's describing that this was a law that there was going to be a fire that's going to be burning on the Mizbech all night until the morning. And then what? Labasha kohen midovad. He's going to put on his clothing of linen. Right? He'll also put on pants of bad of linen. So he's going to do trumat deshen. And then he's going to put that next to the mizbeach. He's going to remove his clothes and then he'll wear other clothes. So we see we mentioned this before, and we will come back to it a little bit more again. But whoever did Trumat HaDeshen also had to change his clothes. He was going to get dirty, and so it was also, so you see, it was like a singular activity. One person did it. One person went and scooped the deshen off of the mizbeach, and then he would change his clothes and take it out of the machaneh. Right? It can't go out. The Kohen will burn on it wood every morning. And then he'll put on it the olah, onto that fire, he'll put the olah and the fats from the shlamim. And it ends off, so there's actually a lot of drashot here. We're going to learn out in Hayatir that in any given time, there's a machloket about this in the Gemara, but in any given time there were at least 3 ma'arachot, there were at least 3 that were burning. One of them was burning specifically to fulfill this mitzvah, always having a fire burning on the mizbeach. And one of the purposes of the Beit HaMoked was to also have a fire burning, that in case the fire needed to be lit at any time, in other words, it was always supposed to be burning, but if it needed to be lit, they could bring fire from the Beit HaMoked to light it up. So this is what's being described here. This is a quick description of the Truma Hashem. Let's continue. Yes.
Then you should be very careful if you want to clear the ashes without to keep the fire nevertheless burning. It's not that easy.
Well, so the ashes. So here it'll describe it a little bit more. The ashes. You're right. We'll talk a little bit more about it as we go. It's going to explain a little bit more as we go. I don't have it. I was going to show you this here. So you see in the picture, hold on a second. I don't want to make a red mark here. Just a second. No, it doesn't matter. So, this is the Mizbeach, right? So this triangular thing here, that's the Kevesh, and this is the Mizbeach. The way the Rambam drew this, right, it's, most of this is like an overhead look, but what he did is he took, this is a side view of the Mizbeach. This is not an overhead view of the Mizbeach. I sent I sent the other one also, which was the Rambam's drawing. This is a more detailed side view of the Mizbeach without the ramp, without the Kevesh. We'll go back to this later, but if you imagine, it described where they left the Machta. So it said the Machta was in the corner between the Kevesh and the Mizbeach. So I need to get a better illustration, but this, right? So remember, this direction here is west. This is east, and the Kevesh would go out from the middle of the Mizbeach in this direction. And so over here in the corner there would be a Machta. roughly, and he would pick it up and then go up the kevesh and do the Trumat Hadeshin. Let's see. Lo hayu ro'in oto, v'lo shomin et kolo, ad sheshomin kol ha'etz, she'asa ben katin muchni lakior. So they wouldn't see him, and they wouldn't even hear his voice until they heard the sound of the wood that Ben Katin made for the muchni, for the kior. So, right, because again, right, why won't they hear him? They're not going to see him because he's not carrying a torch. They're all over, not a huge distance, but they're away from him, next to the Beit Oseh Chavitin, and he's walking along and he's finding his place based on following the light that's emitting from the top of the Mizbeach. He would, before he would pick up the Machta, he would go wash his hands and legs at the kior. So when they hear him washing, then they would hear the muchni of the kior. That's when they would know that he's going to be starting the Hein Omrim, and they would say to him, Higia 8, the time has come. So sort of going back and forth here, but just this is the area roughly of the kior. The kior is in between the Mizbeach and the Ulam, right? Which is sort of the outer part of the Beit HaMikdash proper. So that's where the kior is. It's conveniently located next to the Mizbeach. So he would go, and we described the muchni last time. What was the muchni?
It was an invention by Ben Katin to lower the kior in the water of the well of the mikveh, so to avoid the problem of becoming impure. The water, everything in the vessel become impure during the night. So mixing the pure water and the impure water, they can use the kior immediately in the morning without the problem of changing the water and whatever.
Right.
So it was a mechanism to lower the kior down to the flowing water of the mikvah of the well during the night. So it was pure in the morning.
Right.
So can use easily. It was a very good invention.
Very good. So very good. So we'll
Could you
see
repeat
in
it
a moment.
because it's very muffled?
I'll talk about it because we're going to see it in the Bartanura again. I just wanted to see if any, if you remember. But you remember last time I showed you the picture, and the kior looked like a well, had like a rope, right? So according to one perush, the perush that Shira mentioned is that the muchni was this mechanism to lower the kior into a bore of water, right, into a cistern. The reason being, the kior is a kli shar. It's one of the kelim of Beit HaMikdash, and one of the dinim that is associated with a kli sharet is when you put something into it, it becomes kadosh, right? It has a certain kind of jah, and you can't, if you leave it overnight, it's pasul. So according to this interpretation of what the muchni was, the way what Ben Katin trying to do was to avoid having to spill out water that sat overnight in the kior. And the way it was avoided is to lower the kior into a cistern, so then it's connected directly to the waters underground, and therefore it doesn't become pasul belina, because it's like because it's connected to the ground. It's not sitting out by itself in the kli sharet to become pasul. So this is one interpretation. Let's see this now in the Bartanura. Ben Katin, Kach Shemo Shel Kohen Gadol. That was a particular Kohen Gadol. That was his name. Shasam Muchni Lekiyor. Algal Hasovev Shal Yado Mishakim Hakiyor Babor. It was a wheel that would turn, that through it, or by way of it, it would lower the kiyor into a cistern. Wait,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Michael, what did you say?
It sounds like it could have been kind of block and tackle or pulley.
Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like.
Right. So I was asking if muchni is from a same root as mechona.
Yeah, so I'll mention that in a moment. So yeah, according to this, muchni is like mechona, which is also like machine, right? They're all related words. It's a kind of a mechanism that would be used to lower the kiyor into this cistern. Anything that would become kadosh in a kli sharei, nifsal b'linat laila. It'll become pasul if it's left overnight. This is not true only of water that's left in the kiyor. It would also be true if, say, flour was put into a kli sharei, and then for some reason it got left overnight. It would also, once something goes into a kli sharei, it takes on certain dinim. So when the kiyor was sunk into the cistern, the waters would not become pasul. The Rambam Omer, Shahamuchni hu plis vivato lakiyor. He understood the muchni to be something else. He says that the muchni was a kli that was around the kiyor, and I'm going to correct this in a moment, but this is what the way the Bartanura understood the Rambam. Shalonit kadesh b'chlei sharei. The muchni wasn't a mechanism; it was a kli that was like attached to the kiyor, and it itself was not a kli sharet. It wasn't mukdash as a kli sharet, but it could hold water. So since it wasn't a kli sharet, even if you left water in it overnight, that water would not become pasul. And then in the morning,
I don't understand it. I don't understand how it could not be a kli sharet.
Because it wasn't made as a kli sharet. It wasn't mukdash as a kli sharet. To be a kli sharet,
okay.
So the key per se is something that's mandated in Torah, right? The Torah says you have to kiyor nechoshet. You have to make a kiyor nechoshet. So when the kiyor is made, God, did you want to say something?
Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so in other words, the kiyor is a kli sharet because it's mandated in the Torah, and once it was made, it becomes a kli sharet. So then the water that gets put into it becomes mukdash. The chidush, according to the Rambam of Ben Katin, is he made another kli, and that wasn't mandated by the Torah, but it wasn't forbidden by the Torah either, right? In other words, it was allowed. It's something that was considered to be allowable. You could have a separate kli. It's not a kli sharet. You could store the water in there. It would like like an out. I can't think of the word, right? But like a separate water holder that would be next to the kiyor and attached to the kiyor, and presumably it had a way of opening it. So maybe some kind of an internal opening, right? That you could adjust from the outside that would allow water to come into it. And so then in the morning, that's what, right, because it has to make a sound. The muchni has to make a sound. We see from the Mishnah, Lo hayu ro'ino tov lo shamin kol ad sheshomin kol ha'etz shasa ben katin muchni lakiyor. So according to the Rambam, this eitz could have been a like a handle that when you turned it, it would release water from the muchni into the kior. The shama
So is the muchni?
Go
Sorry, I'm just
No, please.
just in terms of understanding the word. Is it something that was muchan or nachon or?
Yafeh.
No, I think
So-
muchni is a Greek word because mechonan, mechanism are the same word.
So the Rambam, right, so that's what we say, according to the first Perush, which is the way Rashi understood, and that's the first that's the Perush that the Bartuno brought also in Yoma, and now he's bringing that Muchni is a mechanism. But according to this other Perush, Muchni, the Mefarshim say that Muchni, according to this, would come, like Shuli is saying, from the word Muchan, or something that was there as to prepare or to be ready, to have ready water, like my Muchanim. Right?
So, although it could be sort of playing off of our other sense, the word mechanism. I mean, mechanism would either be something what we think is being mechanical, or it could be sort of like a way around things. So when we talk about a cycle in our modern use, we talk about a psychological mechanism, which is a way of working around something.
Well, I don't know if it would be working around something, but it's a device, and this is also a device. When you're thinking mechanism broadly is a kind of a device, I believe, is what you're trying to say. That's not true, but I will say that what Shuli said, other Meforshim who explain the Rambam that he must understand the Muchni to come from the word like Muchan, or that it may come from the word kan, like the same word like al kano, like a base. Maybe it was a base because maybe it was next to the base of the kior. In any event, let's leave aside these etymologies. I just want to finish the Bartanura. The Sham, right? So in this kli that was according to the way it's brought here, that was around the kior. Shama yuman yichima mayim balayla. That's where they would leave the water at night. Kedei shelo yitkadshu. Dafka, so that it would not become kadosh. Yipaslu balayla, and thereby become pasul at night. This word, I just want to point out something interesting. And this something I kind of alluded to earlier. He says the Bartanura says that according to the Rambam, the Muchni was kli that was around the kior. So where does he get that? So I'll just point out the Rambam in the Mishnah Mishnayot. Just a second. Yeah. This is the Rambam in the Perush Mishnayot, and this is in the Bar Ilan project. This is Kapach's translation. It doesn't have his notes, but it has his translation. So this is a kind of a fine point that was interesting, and I'll show you. The Rambam says, "Ukvarnit ba'er b'shlishi di Yoma." It's already been explained in the third chapter of Yoma. Sheben katin asa kli al hakior. He made a kli on the kior. Shehem male mayim, that it would be filled with water. V'haya chol. In other words, it wasn't kadosh; it was chol. Kedei shelo yipasu meimav belina, so that the waters would not become pasul by being left overnight. Klomar shelo yalino achar shenitkadshu hamayim b'kior. That is to say, that they wouldn't be left overnight after they had become kadosh as water that was in the kior. The fisha kol davar shenitkadesh b'kli sharet imlan nifsal. So where does the Bartanura get the idea that it was a kli that was around the kior? So the way he gets that, and this is basically what virtually all of the Rishonim must have thought that the Rambam was saying, because that was the translation that they had אני אשוויץ לכם קצת, I'll do something. Oh, it's elsewhere. Hold on a second. Just a second. Here we go. So this is, let's look for a second at the Rambam back in Mishnah Yoma, where it talks about this, right? Ben Katina Sashtema Sardad Likior. We talk about this here in Tamid, but we mentioned it when we learned in Yoma, that he also made 12 spouts, 12 teats that came out of the Kior, Shel Hayulo Eloshtayim, because to begin with, it only had 2. V'af samuchni l'kior. He also made a muchni for the kior. Shelo yu meimav nifsalin belina. So the Rambam here, starting here, v'kior michlal klei share. This edition of Rambam, this is the translation that's found in standard editions of Shas and most of the earlier editions of Mishnah that included the Perush of the Rambam. So he says that Kiyor Michal Klei Sharet. The Kiyor was one of the Klei Sharet. Ukeshayu bo mayim nitkadshu, right? So if water would be in it, the water would become kadosh. The nifsalu belina, they would become pasul by being nai. Kamosh yidbaer bim komo, as it will be explained in its place. This one, another Ben Katin, made a kli chol. Now this little ha'ara here, I sent this in because originally I told here they should change, at least note that Kafach says this was a mistake. In the translation that you see in the printed editions, it says Zeh sakli saviv lakior instead of chol. It says saviv lakior, and that's where the Bartanur and virtually all the Rishonim and the Achronim who came after him thought that meant that the Rambam's idea of the muchni, that there was like another kli that went around the key. But it's not so. It was a mistake by the translator. The Kafach explains, because the word chol, I don't know if it's pronounced chol or chul, in Judeo-Arabic means around, like from like word like bachol or halal.
That's it.
So the person who was translating it misunderstood. But the Rambam means a kli chol. He means a kli that was not kadosh. And how do we know for sure that that's what the Rambam meant? Because keep losing my place here. Hang on a second. The Rambam, because when you look at the Rambam in the Mishneh Torah, that's what he says. Right? So this is the Rambam Hilchot Beit HaBchira, Perek Gimel Halacha Yud Chet. He talks about the Kior. And he says, "Umuchni asulo." They made a muchni, shiyu bat hamayim tamid, that the water should always be there. He chol. Here he says it clearly. It's chol. That's what he meant. He didn't mean that it went around. He meant that it was not a kli kadosh. It was a kli chol. It wasn't a kli sharet. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression. I kind of got into it and like put it all together, and then I sent to the Al-Hara people, and they made that little hara. So that was one of my little accomplishments this week.
Koach.
Baruch Tia. I think what we'll do, it's almost 9 o'clock, and the truth is, I'm extremely tired. I think what we'll do is we'll finish off here, and then next time we'll go on, I think, to Perek Bet. So, so this is, now we're getting into sort of the drama of what happened, right? So it's earlier in the morning. They did this, checking around the Azara. All the Kohanim met up at Beit Osei Chavitin. Whoever had won the pious now is going to go off on his own in the dark, and he's going to go and wash his hands and legs. The other Kohanim, they're going to hear him either draw the water by, according to the one Perush, that like he would now be lit up the kior from the bore, or according to the Rambam, he'd probably be opening some kind of a spout, and they would hear that and the water coming into the kior, and then they would say to him, Higia 8, the time has come. Then Kidesh Yadav Raglav Mina Kior, he would wash his hands and legs for the kior. Natal Machtata Kesef, he would take this silver whole shovel, v'alala rosh mizbeach, and go on to the top of the mizbeach, or the head of the mizbeach, ufina et gechalim helach vehelach. He would push aside the coals this way and that. Chatam min hamukalot apnimiyot. He would scoop at, this should have actually been, he would scoop at those that were eaten on the inside. In other words, those that were Bartanu explains, Hagechalim shebe'emtza ha'esh. These are he would be going to the coals that were in the middle of the fire, shenit aklu hetev, that had been well consumed, behin krovim liyot deshen, and now they're close to being the ash, right? So we all seen this at a bonfire, whether you're using coals or whether you're using a log. At some point, you can still see the shape of it, and then when you push it, it just becomes ash. I think that's what he's describing here. Higia l'ritzpa, hafach panav l'tzafon. He was to the floor, and he would turn his face northward. Halach lemizrachos shel kevesh ke'eser amot. He would walk to east of the ramp about 10 amot. V'tzavar et hagechalim al gabei harizpa, and he would pile the coals onto the ritzpa. Rachok mina kevesh shosha tvachim, away from the ramp by 3 tvachim. Makom shenotnim murot ha'of, that's where they would put the murot ha'of. V'dishun mizbeach ha'pnimi v'hamnorah. That's also where they would take the ashes from the golden altar from inside, and also any of the ash that came from the menorah. Right? Part of the mitzvah was what we just saw, right? It was part of the act of doing Shumat Deshen, was then to place the Deshen next to the Mizbeach. The Darshan, right, there's a drasha that says Visamo, and he placed it, Kulo. He placed all of it, Visamo, and also that they weren't out from it, Shelo Yifazer, so it wouldn't scatter. So he would gather it up so it wouldn't scatter. And then later on it would be taken outside altogether. But since it's 9 o'clock, I think we'll stop here. I'm gonna get you for next time better diagrams to understand the geography of what was going down, what was going on here. But basically, he scooped up the deshen. He came down the ramp, and then, as he's coming down the ramp, he's face south, and he gets to the bottom of the ramp. If he turns to his right, if he turns around, now he'll be facing north, and his right side is east, and he's going to walk to the east side of the Mizbeach, and there was a place that was 3 tefachim from the east side of the Mizbeach, about Eser Amot, and that's where they will pile this up. I'll try to make a better diagram for next time. But I think this is a good place to stop. Does anybody want to add anything or ask anything before we finish?
Yishar kochacha.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Good night.
All right, so that's it.
תודה, תודה רבה.
לילה טוב לכולם.
Laila Tov.
Bye-bye.